What do you do when there's nothing on? You go to books, right? Well, I have some books to recommend after this. Hello out there, I'm the oldest nerd, and we are in between time. As we're taping this, the season premiere of Doctor Who is yet to come. The season premiere of the mini episodes of Star Trek Discovery are yet to come. The Orville will be weeks away, and virtually everything else is not ready yet. So I'm thinking, what can I do but go to the bookshelf? And I realize I have a number of books that I could recommend to you if you want to know more about the Trek universe by people who are directly involved in it. Let's start out with this one. This is a very old book. It's called The World of Star Trek. It was written by David Gerrold, who was the scriptwriter for The Trouble with Tribbles. It has a lot of behind the scenes of the original series, how it was produced, some of the problems that they came through, some interesting pictures of models that they used, off-camera moments and things like that. It's a good book to get started on the original series, and it was also, this edition in fact goes all the way to Star Trek 3, talking about things behind the scenes. If you want to know how television is made, this is a very good book for that. Second thing I would recommend is this by William Shatner. Now, generally speaking, William Shatner is sometimes derided by even fans about his opinions on various things. For instance, he said in public that he wouldn't want to travel in space, really. It would be better done by robots. A lot of things that he says, though, make a lot of sense. And in this book, he had kind of a controversial point of view. He says that basically the genius behind Star Trek was not so much Gene Roddenberry as it was Gene Coon. Now, Gene Coon was the executive story editor, and he had also been an Academy Award nominee for previous work that he had done. He came up with the idea of the Federation. He came up with the idea of the Klingons. Roddenberry's idea was the United Earth Space Probe Agency and the Romulans, but by creating the Klingons, Gene Coon actually turned the corner from an interesting sci-fi concept to something that you could really follow week after week. So that's one of the major things in this first book. Now, Shatner has another book that follows this called Star Trek Movie Memories. Not quite as good as this one, but this is a really must-read for knowing something about the origins of the original series. Another book that we like, this is Inside Star Trek. This was written by Herb Solow and Robert Justman. Herb Solow was the head of production at Desilu Studios. Lucille Ball was the studio head, but really the person who made most of the decisions and the person that did most of the day-to-day operations of the studio was Herb Solow. And he worked very well with Lucy. You can still credit Lucy with having a lot to say about Star Trek ever getting on the air, and he gives her a lot of credit in this. Now, Bob Justman was one of the associate producers of the original series. He also worked in the first season of The Next Generation. He was a genius at being able to do things with very small budget, and also had a great sense of humor. One of the best memo writers around in the early days of Star Trek. We recommend this, Inside Star Trek, Herb Solow and Robert Justman. By the way, I'm not getting any money off all of this. This is just stuff that I have in my own library, books that I've read that have informed me on various aspects of Star Trek that have benefited me in this channel. So I just want to share that with you today. Okay, if you've gotten that far, I have another book. We've already talked about Shatner having a book, and I've lost the dust jacket on this. But this is called To the Stars. It's written by George Takei, and while it has a great deal of information about Star Trek, it also says something about Takei's early life. It may not be a surprise to you that he and his family were put in an internment camp during World War II, and life in that internment camp he puts in this book, and it is fascinating. Even if you don't get anything from the Star Trek memories he has in this, the way that he learned his craft in acting back when he was a child, back in an internment camp, watching some of the old people that were entertaining the rest of the people who were there, is a fascinating story, and I recommend it. It's George Takei, and it's called To the Stars. While we're talking about people who've had something to do with the show, we also recommend this by Nicholas Meyer. This is The View from the Bridge, Memories of Star Trek and a Life in Hollywood. Nicholas Meyer was essentially the writer of Star Trek II, Star Trek III, and Star Trek IV, although he's not credited completely for all of those movies. He did have a major hand in writing it. And he's more recently been working on a project for CBS, so we may yet see what he has from there. But he has a very academic sounding view from his way of interpreting how Star Trek has been done and received. So those are some very good books on how things work in putting together a television show, putting together a movie from the point of view of actors and producers and writers. Oh, and one more. Harlan Ellison has an entire book on City for the Edge of Forever. He only passed away a few weeks ago, really, and this is worth reading. It has the original script, or the original treatment that he had, and actually a script for City on the Edge of Forever. It is somewhat different than what was filmed because, as always with any kind of television program, there is a budgetary situation where you can't always have that many actors, you can't have that many different scenes, and so this is what Harlan Ellison originally intended for City on the Edge of Forever. It had a few extra characters in there, a few extra subplots, and it's a very worthy read. Just for fun, this is the Nitpickers Guide for Next Generation Trekkers. There are several volumes of the Nitpickers Guide by Phil Farrand. And basically what they do is they take episode by episode and pick out all of the inconsistencies. This was the first book in that series, starting with Next Generation. They eventually did it for the original series and for various further seasons of the Next Generation. But what started him wanting to write this book was a very simple premise that when were the comms turned on and turned off on the Enterprise? Sometimes you had to tap your comm badge, sometimes you had to tap an ODN panel, sometimes you just looked up. And when did you know when it was on and when it was off? Sometimes it would just stop talking and it would be off. He mentions a scene where Wesley Crusher is being paged by his mother. And he says, "Oh no, her again, Crusher here." And how much of that did his mother hear on the other side of it? How does the computer know when he was intending to respond to her communication? And so things like that are mentioned in this book. And it's a fun book to read. You can find your favorite episode and then see what inconsistencies there are in it. It does not detract from the enjoyment of the shows. In fact, it gives you a little look in how it's done and the things that we'll ignore when we immerse ourselves in the story. And finally, if you have something that you just want to look at the pictures, this is a great book by J.M. Dillard with an introduction by William Shatner. It's called Star Trek Where No One Has Gone Before, and it has behind-the-scenes pictures and artwork from the original series through The Next Generation. So, in fact, through Deep Space Nine and a little bit into Voyager. So it's a nice book. It's mostly pictures. It's enjoyable. So if you find yourself in between shows and needing something to read, like I say, I'm not getting any money for this. These are just things I have in my bookshelf. You may not find them for sale in print anymore, but if you see any of these in a estate sale or a secondhand bookshop or something in the used books things on Amazon, you might want to pick up one of these. It makes for an interesting read. We'll have something more as some of the new series get started, but until then, don't go far. And don't forget to subscribe.